All right, thanks for the introduction, Bill, and thanks everybody for taking an interest in this session. The work that I do is, as Bill said, part of Nomad Science, which is an organization that I started to kind of be at the nexus of research and cultural heritage protection and education and a little bit of tourism as well to fund what we're doing. We primarily work in the Darkhad Depression in northern Mongolia. This is a former lake basin, tens of thousands of years ago. A big lake there, kind of a sister lake to what, similar to what Hovskol looks like today. And then some time ago, the kind of natural dam that was there holding that back broke, and all the water flooded out, leaving this big bowl, this big basin. So a lot of our work has been in this basin. Bill and Byra first took me there over 10 years ago now. And then I've since gone back to continue to work with Byra there in the basin. Now, Nomad Science does a lot of different things. You'll hear today from several of our other collaborators. Byra will talk about some of the salvage work that we're doing, of course. We've come across a lot of looting in the region, so he'll talk about some of that. Kristen and Caroline are going to talk about some of the textiles that came out of that, another Nomad Science project. We have Camilla Sturm, who is going to talk about some of the pottery related to the Bronze Age that we're doing. We have some museum experts here, Monktugo and Erden Setseg and Batjargal Erden, who are here on the American Fund, Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation. That also has to do with some of the Nomad Science stuff we're doing. So I have a very friendly audience here, people who are working with me. So we do a lot of different things. But one of the kind of foundational things that we started doing was all of this work on Kyrgyzstans and deer stones, super important stuff, right? But on the other side of that, there's so much more that people are doing that's not related to funeral and ceremonial activities. These are everyday kinds of activities where people are living, where they're working, and those kinds of things often have no signal on the surface of the ground. And so we're having to come up with methodologies to try to find campsites, habitation sites, houses, workplaces that have no visible thing or very little visible kind of markers on the surface. And so we started doing some surveys of the region to locate where people are living. What we're really interested in is this transition from hunting and gathering to herding. Of course, Mongolia today is so wrapped up, so connected to herding culture. And yet, just like everywhere else in the world, the vast majority of your Mongolian ancestors, of our human ancestors, were not herders, they were hunters and gatherers. And so this transition is really foundational to understand Mongolia today. The national identity, the history, the culture, the economy is so wrapped up in herding, and yet we know very little about that transition. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do. And it changes what goes into your cooking pot. It changes the kind of meat that you're eating, but it changes everything else at the same time. We see big changes in the way people are practicing their religion or spiritual ceremonial acts. We see big changes in the way people are using the landscape. It changes how people relate to animals, obviously. Having ownership over an animal is a very big shift that you have to make in your mind as well as a physical part of what you're doing. It changes how people relate to their landscape, what kinds of resources and where you are in the landscape. And then, of course, it also changes the way that people relate to each other, the way that you express power and wealth completely changes as well. So it's about what you eat, but really it's about everything. And so that's why this particular period is interesting to me. If you go out in the Mongolian landscape, of course, it is vast, right? And so if you can't see evidence of these kinds of sites on the surface, we have to have a way of kind of narrowing that down to see where are we going to find sites. So a big part of what I do is predictive site modeling. So we take the landscape and we say, okay, in this landscape, where are we likely to find settlements? And there's three big ways in which we do that. Known archaeological sites. If we have some archaeological sites that are known, we can kind of get the formula. Where are these kinds of places located? A lot of that is related to kind of topographical clues or common sense. where would you put your campsite, right? You don't want it on maybe a very steep slope. You want to have access to resources. Those kinds of clues can help us narrow it down. And then finally, ethnographically, we can talk to people today and say, how are you using the landscape? A lot of times Mongolia is portrayed as this extremely traditional place. And yes, nomadic people living in the countryside live in a very different way than we do, but we do have to remember that everybody changes. And so the way that people are moving around the landscape can give us clues that we can then check out with archaeology, but we have to have that backed up. And certainly when we're talking about hunter-gatherer ancestors, they definitely use the landscape in very different kinds of ways. So we've run these predictive models in the Darkhad Depression in the basin, and we've gotten pretty good. We haven't found every single thing that's out there using the predictive models, but we would never expect that. There's always a strange thing. People are weird. They occasionally do something that's kind of off. But that we're finding the vast majority of our artifacts within the areas that we're modeling is a really good indicator that we're on the right track. So we're really excited about that, but we realize that all of the work that we're doing is within the Darkhad Depression. So it's working there, but we know for sure that there's got to be stuff in the taiga, these higher elevation areas around the Central Depression. Now, we don't have much archaeologically. There's one site that Bill worked on called Barangol, which I'll talk about in just a moment. We do have the same topographical common sense kinds of filters that we can apply to what we're looking at. We've been talking to local people about where they live. So this one site of Barangol is our example to start with. So we have a couple of black chert flakes, a depression that might be a pit house, and then some quartz and quartzite flakes and things found in the site. That's a really good start, but it's a single site. And so we really wanted to add to what we know about that. So we know that there are people who are using this high elevation landscape. First of all, it makes sense. There's all kinds of different resources that are available and there in different seasons that aren't available in the lowlands. We have the site of Barangol. We know today that people go back and forth for all kinds of different reasons. There's lots of medicinal plant gathering, nuts and berries, lots of trade, commerce, education, politics, family, social relationships, lots of movement between these highland and lowland areas. Today, the highlands are occupied by mostly Tatan or Dukha people, and then the lowlands by Darkhad people. So there's a division there, but still lots of interaction back and forth. When we go to do it, first of all, to get up into these areas is much more logistically challenging, even beyond the normal research constraints. No cars, no motorized vehicles, so we get up there and then our traditional methods of finding these sites kind of break down in a lot of ways. They're really rocky slopes or really highly vegetated. It can be really hard to see the surface of the ground. And so a lot of the methods we were using in the basin to locate these kinds of habitation and work sites just aren't working in this area. So, okay, the other thing we can do is go to our ethnographic examples. And these sites are nice because there's definitely reasons that people want to live there, right? So we have that going for it. Additionally, you can see the movement of animal and people creates these kind of bare spots. And those bare spots often turn up artifacts we find, right? And so we've been looking at lots and lots of these campsites, and still we didn't find anything. So something's not working. The way that they're using the landscape today doesn't seem to match very well with how it may have been used in the past. Okay, so we found another reason to take us up to the taiga. Working with Dr. William Taylor, I'm really sorry we didn't get to hear his presentation earlier today. We started going up into these high elevation areas to do some ice patch work. So the idea is there are these snow and ice patches that are located high in these areas, and they're year-round. They don't completely melt ever. Because of global climate change, these things are starting to shrink down and shrink down and shrink down. So any archaeology that may have existed inside of these snow and ice patches is now exposed. And so we travel to these places, do surveys over them, and see if we can find any archaeological material. What's exciting about it is if we do find anything, these things have been in snow and ice. And so we see preservation that we don't normally see in other places. So that's really exciting for us. Now, snow and ice patches high up in the mountains here, why would people go there? We know ethnographically the reindeer herders really rely on these snow and ice patches. Reindeer are super, super, super well adapted to cold weather. So even the warm summer that's not so warm for us is too hot for reindeer. Their hair, their bodies are just made for really cold temperatures. So to get some relief from the bugs and from the heat, reindeer will often go to these snow and ice patches. And there's several other kinds of animals that also do that. So whether you're a herder looking for your reindeer or a hunter looking for places where animals might congregate, these ice patches are a place that you might visit. So in various places around the world, we find spears and arrows, pouches that fall off of your belt, and they're stuck in that ice. So now, as these shrink, it's critical that we get to some of these areas and do some surveys. In 2018, we did find some pieces of probably a fishing pole, is what our ethnographic sources suggest we were seeing. Will has some much more exciting finds from out in far western Mongolia. You'll have to ask him about it if you ever come across him. But really exciting and interesting stuff. So in doing this ice patch archaeology, that gave us a good reason to go to these places, and in doing that, we were able to find 4 new kinds of sites. And these would be in addition to the bar and gull site that Bill found. So these sites are not, 4 new sites is not that big exciting news in Mongolia, right? There's thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of sites across Mongolia. So 4 new ones isn't all that exciting, except that we have nothing in these kinds of higher elevation areas previously. So these 4 sites are primarily composed of just some lithic fragments. Most of it is this dark black chert that we're finding all over this region. And these 4 sites do 2 things for us. They help expand our model so that we're no longer working on just what's happening inside the basin, and they also help contextualize the ice patch archaeology that we find, right? So those are the 2 big things it's doing for us. The first site that we found was in the eastern Taiga region. So in this part of Mongolia, there's 2 kind of populations of reindeer herders. One is living in an area called the eastern Taiga and the other in the western. We visited both this year. In the eastern Taiga, there was kind of a knob with an ovo right on the top of it. So out on survey one day, we came across a pretty prolific lithic scatter, lots and lots of lithic scattered over the surface. What's really interesting about this site is it also had some bits of vitrified clay or sand. So this is a really high temperature something going on there, whether it's metal production or pottery production, something very exciting happening at this site. The second site we came across, happened when we went to the West Taiga area. This is a place where a lot of people go to collect berries and nuts. So it's not a permanent campsite. There's not people that live there a lot of the time, but people stop over for a couple of nights to collect berries and nuts there. So we found a couple of lithic scatter fragments there. The third site we found was very strange, just kind of this muddy area right along a pass. We think that this one is really hard to categorize because it's not in an area you would want to live. You would not want to set up your tent there, obviously. So either something is washing in, or because it was a pass, people were traveling through that area. It's the one that doesn't quite fit what we see. And then the final one is on this slight rise and had a lot of formalized tools as well as cores, so a lot of activity going on there. Probably our most exciting of the sites. And so if we take a look back, what these 4 sites are doing is providing a template that we can then use to kind of focus our search in other areas of the taiga. So in all the cases except that one weird site, we have kind of a slight rise. It's kind of drier and elevated, and the surface is much more visible. So that's really exciting to us, because all of this area around here is really, really hard to see the ground, so we wouldn't see these kinds of things, and it's marshy, so it wouldn't be a great place to set up. But of course, in the past, the environment may have been significantly different. We're talking about thousands of years of history. Things have changed. And so one of the things we're going to have to do next year is determine, is it true that these kinds of high and dry areas within the taiga are where people were preferring to live? Or is it just that that's where we can see it today? It's possible that people were camped all over here, so we're going to have to go back and employ some subsurface methods, so it's auger pits or shovel tests or something to get below the surface to determine, we're probably going to be digging a lot of empty holes, but we're going to have to determine that it's not just a product of what we can see today. So that's a lot of what we're going to be doing. We'll go back, we'll continue, we're working very hard to work with local communities and the national park. This particular area has kind of been rezoned in the last 10 years to be part of a national park and a strictly protected area, so we're working very closely to make sure that we're working with local administration, government administration, as well as communities to do that. The subsurface testing and collection of these archaeological sites, we've always gone in there without permits to collect anything or dig for anything, but now we kind of hope that we're far enough along that we'll be able to do that. Another thing we'll be doing in this area is sourcing raw materials. This black chert that's seen throughout the region, we've gotten some ethnographic sources. People who still have their flintlock rifles are telling us that the source of it is somewhere up in this area. So we're going to go check that out, see if we can find that. And then finally, we'll be refining our site predictive models to include these higher elevation areas. So no longer are we working just in the basin, but we're going to go up into these higher elevation areas so we have a more complete picture of how people are using the landscape. That's what I've got for you.
Lots of questions. Okay, so first of all, one of the things that further north in the Russian Taiga, I know one of the things that people always, and I experienced it a little bit myself, which is that open areas seem nicer, but the trouble is you go to the open areas and suddenly like all these mosquitoes. So I'm wondering if you factor mosquitoes into your. I have a lot of questions, so let me just run. The other one is ethnographic data is about how people have been using the environment. I wonder also about ethological data, about how animals have been using the environment, because that's also changed, and there's been a lot of change in animals. I mean, I've gotten very interested in some of the research, trying to track down references to, in historical sources, to wild animals, particularly in Siberia, these sort of boreal animals, which for a lot of people in the Mongol Empire period, they're really interesting. They're like, oh, they have these kind of animals, and there's some that I still don't know what they are. So I'm just wondering if working with animal behavior people and ecologists is sort of how the animals might have because over time from the sort of hunter-gatherer to the Neolithic Revolution, of course, also, and even today, the distribution of animals has changed. I'm always so impressed by the fact that, for example, the first type specimen of the holon was collected in what's now Russia, in an area where it's not just like there's no holon there now. They're like there's no holon within like 1,000 miles of there. Right. Now. So I'm just wondering how you, if and how you factor in maybe changes of how animals have been their distribution, how they also use the environment. To look at that, because people will be following the animals
related because mosquitoes are animals too, right? So the ecology of that. So the bugs is definitely something that determines where people live and how often they move and where they are. And ice patches are an important part of that. Ice patches do, and also people are finding places where they do get a slight breeze, and those are sometimes open areas or higher elevation areas than we would predict. And that breeze can kind of keep bugs away to some degree, and also something we don't think about when we see these high intensively burned things, the smoke that comes off of those is sometimes toxic or smelly or stuff. So sometimes they are also in slightly higher areas just to get a breeze to move away smoke or bugs.
I remember once camping with Giltov, and they're burning horse manure just to keep the bugs away.
Yeah, we do that on site all the time. And so the second thing about, we have a, I mean, when you start talking about animal ecology, like hunter-gatherer behavioral patterns are intimately entwined with animal patterning, and so it definitely comes into play. We have a colleague, Dr. Stephanie Crabtree, who's now at the Department of Environment and Ecology in Utah, who's going to start working on what we call a food web study. So everything that's in the environment and how they connect to each other. And then when we kind of change one little thing in there, how does that impact the whole system? So we have some interesting stuff in the works that I think relates to what you're talking about. We don't have anything finished that I can definitively say, but it's on our task list. Richard?
Yeah, the ice patch work seems to be very important. But how is that being impacted by global warming, for example?
Yeah,
Do you see signs that the ice is
Absolutely.
receding?
Absolutely. So there's not been a systematic year-by-year study of these ice patches. So we said, you know what, we're going to do that. So in 2018, we went up there and we recorded 11 ice patches in the middle of August, right? But then there is still some time, and we're trying to time our field season so it's when the ice patches are at their minimum. But that's, of course, is right before the snow is coming. So we have to very delicately find that time. So this year we decided to push it even a little bit farther, right? And so we went in the end of August and first week of September, and every single one of those 11 ice patches that we recorded in 2018 was gone in 2019. There's not one left. And now we don't know if they had disappeared by the end of the year last year. That particular area is a summer camp for the reindeer herders, and mid-August when we were there is exactly when they're moving out. So nobody could tell me if if this was the first year that they had completely disappeared. Now, the winter of 2018-19 was extraordinarily dry in Mongolia. There was very little precipitation. The summer of 2019 was extremely wet in Mongolia. There was a lot of rain in this region, and that combination is not good for ice patches. So 2019, not a single ice patch left in the taiga, not one. And I don't know if that's the first time it happened, but we went to everywhere where there was an ice patch to complete our surveys and make sure, but anything that had been preserved in the ice patches is now definitely gone in the taiga. Now, the work that Will is doing out in your area, Richard, is a bit higher elevation, and so they still do have ice patches and are finding extraordinary things. So what I'm going to continue to contribute from the taiga is like I said, the sites that we found are providing some context for ice patch, high elevation kinds of adaptations, and then of course the ethnographic. We have reindeer herders who are using high elevation areas in ways that other Mongolians aren't. So I won't be able to contribute to the actual survey of ice patches anymore. That's finished in that region. We got there just in time or just too late, depending on how you look at it. But we'll contribute in other ways from there. Yeah.
So my question to you, also to Will, I always was troubling to understand in terms of like stones and the quarries, if there were any the sites, because Postcol has the tallest, the biggest deer stones, for instance. And I remember in 2005, I did find a small site where there were some bigger stones that possibly were used for deer stones. But I wonder if your projects or anybody else found the sites in these locations where biggest stones, how they transported them or how they brought them to make those big deer stones.
I've seen some big stones, monoliths near Sumber. In that area, when you get up on the high area, I've seen the big, free stones in rock slides that would be the size of those.
How about Cusco?
There's in one area we've looked at quite a lot is north of Ushkanuver at Erkel Lake on the way to Hubskull. And there's a granite quarry near the lake. And it's the side of the hill has just got big, huge granite slabs all over it. You can see that it's been used more recently as a quarry too, but this is almost certainly where the deer stones are coming from. And I'm not sure if Ushkanuver has a quarry nearby that you know about.
Sumber would be very close to it, actually.
Huh?
The Sumber
Uh-huh.
would be just north of it.
North of Ushkanuver?
Yeah.
But they had great techniques for being able to, granite turns out to be a terrific stone to use because if you drill little plug holes in it, you know, the way in New England, they used to make all the road signs, basically, the mileage indicators and things, and you had a lot of granite there. You just drill little holes, put wooden dowels into those holes that hammer them in, and then you pour water on the wood, and you can just, the stone will split open, and you can see these, in Erkel, you can see these amazing faces, maybe, 10, 20 meters long, where they have split, huge blocks of granite. So I think those techniques were used to break out the stones, and of course, then the real hard work is polishing them and so forth. So a lot of things happened around 3,000, 3,500 years ago in the technology.
At Belut, we had two small quarries of slates, which looked like they were used by the Turkic people to erect their monuments.
The Turkic stones and Sagamaskat that Dan showed pictures of, those stones are not made out of granite or basalt the way most of the central Mongolian stones. That's really hard rock, but in the west they're using softer stones, slate and others. And unfortunately, the result of that is that they've been much easier to make graffiti on. So a lot of the western Mongolian deer stones are really pretty badly damaged by graffiti. So you can just go up to the deer stones today and write your name on them. Yeah.
It's most of the deer stones made by granite or basalt in Mongolia, central Mongolia. So we try to find some quarry, the source of the stones in the big deer stone complexes in central Mongolia. It's really hard to tell. That we found so many similar granites all around. The big deer stone sites, but some of them, for example, in the Han Valley, there's 24 deer stones, and some of them made by basalt. We couldn't find in that valley, and we can find maybe several, the dozens of kilometers away to the other so far. But the good question, how they transport the big, Han Valley, the biggest deer stone is almost 5 tons. So the 3,000 years old people, how they transport the 5 tons stones from, it's like, they made in the site and, chipping or polishing stone, and they just cut everything. So original stone would be maybe more heavier than that. So we just guess they use maybe there's so much animals and peoples to bring in that. Some, we have some idea, like maybe a workshop did in Europe about like ice or or some sledge for, they're taking the stones to the side. But in Temervi River in central Mongolia, the Monaco Mongolian team found the quarry, where exactly the core site near the deer stone site. It's like almost like a kilometer all around the deer stone. So that was exactly, the evidence of the quarry. But other than, it's really hard to tell. Yeah.
So there probably is a good correlation between where the deer stones are and quarries as well. There's a lot of granite.
Yeah.
Actually, just a quickie question. Has there been enough research done in your high altitude places to know either how old some of these sites might have been And the nature of them, were they passing through sites? Were they, we live here year-round sites? Were they, we live here in the summer type sites?
Yeah, great question, and those are all things that we will ask. My preliminary feeling, not having anything properly dated or anything, is that these sites correlate very well to sites that are in the basin that are Neolithic and early Bronze Age. But I think we have a lot more work to do to definitively say that.
So ice patch archaeology is very important in these days in Mongolia because, we never do any ice patch in Mongolia before the Julian Wheel Taylor. So, and for example, unfortunately, we're missing the Dr. William Taylor's presentation last summer. So we can see the exact, the huge impact of the global warming or the warming, the environment there, because ice is melting and shrinking. The snow is shrinking year by year. So when you hike up to the mountain and getting close to the top of the mountain, you can see so much, the hunting animal heads, some part of the animals. So, and the argali head, this wild sheep head. And so when you see the lower slope of the mountain, it's like very eroded and very old. Then when you're close to the snow, it's like getting near or recent, very organic materials is preserved just near the ice patches or the top mountain. So this summer we are planning to, record all that the argali sheeps, like hundreds of them. And luckily we found bronze arrowhead with wooden shaft and sinew on it still. So that was very, amazing discovery was in this summer. So we analyzed them zooms, and so that we found out it's made by deer sinew and sheep bone, and so wood was in willow. So we need to hike up to the mountain then.
Who's ready to hike?
Yeah, this,
Richard.
by the end of the day, you're going to start to feel that archaeologists are just chasing these vestiges that are disappearing in front of our eyes, because with the climate changes and the looting and the value of many artifacts on the international trade market and so forth, you can get discouraged sometimes. But rest assured, people were looting in the ancient times as well, so a lot of the graves were already damaged. Do you want to talk at all about how you recruit your teams or?
Yeah, sure. So Nomad Science is a very different kind of model. I think sometimes people get stuck in the way that they do things, and so there's like the academic model where you do it this way. I like to think I'm kind of academic adjacent. I work with universities, but I'm a whole separate entity. So students who've had classroom archaeology need to learn the field methods. And so I run a very neat scam where I have them come and work with me, and I have free labor even that's paying me to be there. And so that's a lot of how we do this. And it's funny, but I have to say there's also a serious side to this as well, which is that a lot of funding for sciences, for humanities, is disappearing as we go. And so I think all of us are going to have to get more creative in how we fund our research. So working with tourists as well, people who have a good reason to be there, and tourists don't want to be tourists anymore. They want to contribute or do something. They don't want to be called tourists. So if I call them researchers and archaeologists, they'll come along with me and do this. And they provide funds, and they provide labor, and they provide a way for us to get the word out. I think that we as scientists, as researchers, have to do a lot better job about talking to the general public. We sometimes get really good at writing our scientific journals, and those go out, but we don't always talk to people. And these are taxpayers and voters and people who will stand up for us and help protect some of the things we're doing. People who come along and do the ice patches and see it for their own eyes that these things are gone now are important cultural heritage ambassadors. There are cultural heritage allies that can now go out and help us spread the word. So I'm careful about how I pick my teams. I don't just take anybody who's going to come back and loot the site or create problems or go off on harebrained theories. We have real people who really want to contribute to research and science and preservation of these sites, but I think it's an important thing that we're all going to have to get a little bit more flexible and work hard to get our message out there beyond our own disciplines and circles.
How many trips do you make a year, and then how big are the groups in terms of these tourists?
Sure. So my smallest teams are me and a couple of people in a car going to look at something, and then the largest teams I think we've had are around 60 people, and it's always at least half Mongolians. So I never take just foreigners. It's always half and half at least, and so we also provide opportunities for Mongolian students to get the training, for Mongolian professionals to do their research. I talked today about a research side of things. But the thing that Nomad Science and Byra and I have become more passionate about than anything is this salvage archaeology. Like Bill said, a lot of this stuff is going away, and so with this model we were able to very quickly adapt. We didn't have to wait we put in a lot of grant proposals, but we didn't have to wait. We could, with our model, go directly and start doing these things. These sites that are looted, I hope I'm not stepping on Byra's toes here, when these things are thrown about on the surface, they're not gonna be there next year and the year after. Things are disappearing right away. So it's important that we have this flexible kind of entity that can go and respond to these cultural heritage disasters quickly and right away. Yeah.
Okay, we need to move on. Thanks
Yes.
so much.